Hello and welcome to this little recording that we're doing today as part of the Imagine Festival. My name is Patrick McCarthy. I'm Head of Artistic Planning and Operations for the Ulster Orchestra. And joining me is Conor Mitchell, composer. And we're going to spend a few minutes talking about Conor's piece, Democracy Dances. And we're going to have a look at what that piece means for him within the context perhaps of what the orchestra is trying to do at the moment and future projects, and just to find out a bit more about the piece and its relevance for us, for Conor, and for everyone who hears it. We're going to hear the piece in its entirety after we've talked for a few minutes, and we really hope you enjoy it. It's something that we worked on last year, last November. The orchestra has been in residence at the Waterfront Hall since last August, in rather strange circumstances, of course, no audience for anything that we've done, and the players playing at social distance. So when you see the film, you'll see the orchestra spread out across the whole floor of the Waterfront Hall in a way that we don't normally get to do, but it's been a really interesting and fertile period for the orchestra, and one in which we've been able to reach out and connect with other creative people in Northern Ireland in a way that we don't normally get to do, perhaps, within the confines of the normal orchestral season. So, Conor, let's kick off by thinking about the piece and where the piece started, because it started as something very different to where it ended up. It started in a different format. So maybe just tell us a little bit about how the piece started and where it eventually got to.
Unlike a lot of contemporary music, it actually had a kind of two-phase development, and that was completely accidental. It started life as a PRS commission for the New Music Biennial a year before, and that was really as a little showpiece for the ensemble to take to the Queen Elizabeth Hall. And I think that was literally for 9 people, and I wanted just to put the players in a circle and for them all to play to we call a tempo perpetual, just something which is constantly going the entire time, and to really investigate a C-sharp minor chord which changes on 2 numbers, and that was really because the audience were going to be walking around that circle. So I didn't want them to get into the push and pull of rubatos or to be sucked into a piece of music that had an emotional dynamic based on tempo. I wanted it literally to be like a driving rhythm the entire time. And then when coronavirus hit, as you say, new opportunities is the wrong word, but it's also the right word, came up for collaboration and investigating new relationships. And you had come to me and I'd come to you sort of saying, look, is there anything that can happen? I felt that if the ensemble was going to work with the Ulster Orchestra, that we needed to do something that really reflected that collaboration. So just to write a completely new piece of work would have been totally brilliant, but it wouldn't have been the little bit of amber that captured this moment. So what I wanted to do was take that little perpetual and explode it for symphony orchestra and put the ensemble players just as desk partners or whatever within it. So not to make a concerto grosso. I mean, that's kind of what you would do if you were starting from scratch, with an ensemble at the front of the orchestra as a sort of separate thing rather than integrated. So I didn't feel that was appropriate. I actually felt the better thing was for the orchestra almost completely absorb them. And lots of them have played with the orchestra before, so it felt actually like it was a bunch of musicians getting together, and in a sense showing how one little piece of music, just with reorchestration, can become something completely different. But dot for dot, bar for bar, it's exactly the same. And that for me was the amber. It captured this particular moment in time, that a year before we had been 9, and then we had no audience. We had to create something. We had an orchestra without an audience, an ensemble without an audience. So we put ourselves together and we exploded it. And that I think really encapsulated the whole ethos behind the project.
And just let's dig into the notion of democracy, which I think informs not just the performance and the way that your ensemble and the orchestra came together, but also the emerging genesis of the piece and how it changed from its original thing.
Well, when it was first composed, I mean, it was composed in a flash, because the way the PRS funding worked is it was brilliant. It actually allowed us to do this. We had just turned 2 as a company, so it allowed us to do this it's very grand, but this little retrospective of our work, which I wanted to get on the main stages of the Lyric Theatre to prepare for us doing this new piece, which was going to be called Abomination. But we'd never been on the main stage. So I got funding to hold this little retrospective on the main stage of the Lyric that I knew very few people were going to come to. And the PRS really kindly came on board and said, look, we'll help with that, but you need to write a piece at the very end for all of those players, do it in that retrospective, and then bring it to the QEH and to Hull. So there was this total flash of creating that micro festival, and then I think I had a few evenings to create that piece of work. And that meant that I really wanted it to talk about what can happen in 2 years. And it was originally called Lunaria because that's the name of a flower that takes 2 years to bloom. I mean, I generally don't like names like Lunar Pod 6 or Lunaria or Sunbeam, but that felt kind of good because it sounds a little bit like lunatic. So we did that, and a thing that had been really key at that point in time was that Stormont had been out for a very long period of time, and Lara McKee, the journalist, had just been, shot in Derry. So I felt that, in a sense, that was also the story of what happens in 2 years. So you remove the democratic process for 2 years in Northern Ireland. You introduce Brexit, you introduce all this stuff, and then somebody gets shot up in Derry. While, I knew there were other factors within, that murder, it really felt like it was incredibly symbolic that after 2 years, this bright young sort of member of the LGBT community who, was a journalist whose writing was all about a new positive future for Northern Ireland, had been effectively killed by its past not being managed. So that was the original genesis of it. And then when we came to recreate that for larger forces, the politics of Northern Ireland became completely swamped by the politics of the world. So the Trump scenario got completely out of control. Coronavirus happened, and the American election. Also, Brexit was delivered. So pre all of that stuff, the Northern Ireland political situation seemed to me very of its own universe and very significant. But when these global events happened around it, it did kind of shrink the whole thing down. And I thought, if we're going from 9 players to symphony orchestra, the same thing needs to happen with the artistic ethic at the core of it. And that, for me, became, what is this really about? So what was I talking about with the Lara McKee thing in here? It's actually democracy. And then the Trump situation, the Brexit situation, if you boil all those things down, at its core, the conversation is about democracy and whether that's going right or it's going wrong. And the thing that I kept being drawn to again and again and again in my own practice was the situation in Hong Kong, which was kind of being evaporated out of the entire political discourse. But for me, that was planet Earth's big democratic crisis. A lot of conversations about democracy now are based on the idea that democracy is giving us the wrong result. Are the people stupid or are the people clever? Does democracy work, and should it be handled by other people? Or should it be completely removed in the case of Hong Kong? And I felt that was something that was the undercurrent of the entire Trump conversation. I mean, it's very easy to go in artistically and say Trump is the wrong president, but the fact remains that he was democratically elected. So is democracy giving us the wrong results? And if so, should democracy be removed? that felt a very close relative of what was happening in Hong Kong. So the same people that were condemning Hong Kong were the same people that were asking for Trump to be removed. And I felt that's kind of what I wanted to talk about emotionally and put that at the core of the work.
And then, of course, we see that writ large in the visuals for the piece, which are they're almost dizzying to look at, and you really capture the sort of the intensity and the febrile atmosphere of last year so strongly in the music as well. That drive, I just want to pick out a technical point on that drive. The orchestra played to a click track for these recordings. We're playing at social distance, so it's quite a difficult thing to play with that sort of rigour at that sort of distance. But it gives it such energy, and it's such an unusual thing to do. I can't think of another orchestra that's ever played to a click
for 15 minutes or whatever.
For 15 minutes. And it's a very intense experience to listen to, and I'm sure it was a very intense thing for our musicians to do.
Well, it's good. I hope it had that. I mean, it's kind of like running. You can get it or like a kind of mantra or a meditative practice. If you're constantly rehearsing to the same tempo and the music resists the pull of rubato, you have to get into this complete rhythm, and then the job of the composer is to play with the exister or the perpetuel and change it so you don't notice it. So what I tried to do was break the piece into 3 bits, A, B, A, and the 2 external parts are completely tonal. They're completely you could not get more tonal. So they're shifting just chromatically, and so as C sharp minor becomes an A, which will, turn into something like a D or whatever. And those are the bedrock chords. And then in the central section, it kind of becomes a 12-tone piece of music based on one row. And that just keeps rapping down the orchestra and rapping down the orchestra and rapping down there. And then eventually that grows back to block chords. So it was my job to take that template of the ba 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 ba, establish it, ruin it, and then find a way to get back to it. And it ends with these big smashing chords. But at the core of that, there are 2 big numbers, like a 3 and a 5, that you hear crashing. So the start of it is just these crashing 5s, which you always read in your mind as 4s. And everyone just hears those as big dominant downbeats, but actually what it's doing is it's saying, here is a big 5, and pretty soon after that you delete 2 and you've got a big 3, and then you have these numbers that kind of don't work together, and they collide together to give you just 2s and 1s and 2s and 1s and 2s and 1s. So those are big, massive building blocks, and I really wanted to plunder the music of John Adams. That was. I
wanted to ask you about that because you start off quite explicitly in the sound world of somebody else.
Oh yeah.
Almost as if you're just walking in his shoes for the first 3 or 4 minutes of the piece before you take it to somewhere else. What was the thinking behind that? Was it to try and sort of inhabit someone else's head for a few minutes? What was the kind of logic there?
Well, it was to do with that perpetual. I think John Adams is amazing. But he does do a lot of rubato, he pulls back, stuff like that. And if you put techno music on top of that, which is effectively what this is, it's the commercial track that does not slow down or speed up. I wanted to use his vertical techniques and see how I could play with that. Just also because I find it really, really fascinating. I've never really played with smashing chords that are happening again and again. I thought, well, he's, I love it when he goes to that place. So I wanted to investigate it, I think personally, artistically, to see how it works and how you can create a sparkle in the winds over the top. And then find my own way at it. So it's sort of, it was an investigation into his techniques at the start, and then it becomes, that middle section is very, very me. And then I kind of hope the last part is, it's kind of like we've had a baby. But I do really, really, really love looking at the technical powers of other composers. I spend my days reading other composer scores and reading their biographies, which we've just been talking about, and seeing what really intrigues them and trying to lock into their techniques. Mozart taught music by getting composers to physically write out by hand other composers' work, and then would ask them what the second trombone was doing.
Yeah.
So
it's something that jazz composers do as well, of course, and you see it through the practice of jazz musicians endlessly poring over transcriptions of things in a way that it's so different from the way that jazz is created in the moment, but does embed people in the technique and in the language and the tools of someone else.
Well, I think that's a thing that's really been lost. Because we don't handwrite anything anymore, this is about it. But that investigation into what makes a composer's work, how the voice is there, and in the case of the American minimalists, who works on a horizontal and who works on a vertical. I'm very fascinated with. I love turning music apart and saying, actually, like Britain, what is dramatical about Britain's music? Is it the dots on the page, or is it the piece of A4 paper that he's written months before, where he's mapped out, this needs to last for 3 minutes, that needs to last for 2 minutes, there's 5 people in this scene and that lasts for 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. Is that the genius of Benjamin Britten's compositional practice, as opposed to the F minor chord in the harp, in the embroidery or whatever? That kind of particularity really, really engages me. And in the music of Adams, I wanted to step into that for a minute, set it up, kind of play with the sparkle of that kind of orchestrational technique in the vertical, and then push it. The other thing is it had an Americana. And you can hear that, I think, in the last 1 minute of it. It goes to a big kind of Hollywood climax where it reaches that smashing number 1 1 1 1 1 1 1, and I was totally obsessed with trying to find how that can be achieved in orchestration.
So the democracy part of it we have.
Yeah.
The dances bit, you wouldn't have known this at the time because I think we recorded this just around the time of the American election. It comes across to me like a celebration of when democracy can actually work, and I don't know whether that's how you hoped it might.
Yeah, no, you can see. I think in the visuals you see election night, and then it's Biden. I think that was added. I think literally it was the day after, the second day after the election. I felt that piece, regardless of how the American election went, needed to have a sense of hope in it. I don't think as an artist you can start talking about democracy and then, doom everyone to a very negative opinion. I'm very hopeful about democracy, and I actually thought this piece of music always needs to land in these major keys. And I wanted to get back to basics and start something in a relentless minor. Go to 12 tone and then find a relentless major at the end. Clarifying those number sequences. And I love that. If you say to me, here's the symphony orchestra, and you've got 3 percussionists and a big pair of cymbals, I want it to end, hopefully.
That's good. And we're really glad we were able to give you that scale to work on.
But it's brilliant. The weird thing about writing music for me is the sound I always have in my head is considerably larger than most of the forces that I have. And that's like a real error that I have in my writing all the time. I write a series of pieces and then I hear it in the room and I go, crap. I've actually heard this with 80 people and I've got 10. So that it was amazing just to go, all right, let's go for it with everyone.
Do you feel a responsibility as a composer to be commenting on world events, on politics, on politics local and international? Do you feel that that's something as an artist that you should be doing, or is it something that just drives your art naturally?
Well, I think they're effectively the same answer. You can't separate the person from the work. I have a real pathological dislike of ornamental music. I know that lots of people do, and I can totally see how you can just turn on something and just love the violin concerto because of the violin concerto.
Yeah.
You know,
Here's a piece of music about some flowers.
yeah, and I always, like, when we were kind of learning, about music for the first time, there is a type of person who, and Beethoven was part of that, this mindset. He sees the purity just in that piece of music. I think because I'm a bit more theatrical in my life, I see the music as functional. The ornamental music where we just sit down and we watch it and we listen, we critique, we appreciate, and we leave, has never really turned me on. Music that has an opinion, that has the power or the ability to comment on the world that it exists not only in, but has been created from, I find much more appealing. I think I accidentally talk about stuff. I don't sit down and go, I really want to talk about this. And then I just find that I do. I wrote this piece about the DUP, kind of in a flash, was it last year or whatever, where we took incendiary political, like, homophobic rhetoric from the DUP and said it. And it became this kind of like, Conor wants to talk about homophobia in Northern Ireland. But that's not actually why it started. I was just really intrigued with the concept of taking something and if you just say it, sounds offensive. But if you put it in a D major Straussian waltz, it sounds so lovely that people don't realize it's offensive until they're halfway down the M1. That rub of melodic structure and incendiary text, for me, felt the musical and theatrical experiment. And then it took on its own political significance. But I think at its core, everything I do, I kind of want to have a voice. I mean, the pieces that I listen to are called war requiems. They're written in the Second World War, they're written in the First World War. They're written at the point of nervous breakdown or a suicide attempt or a love affair or a birth or, Schubert finding out he has months to live. That's the kind of music where I can get inside the narrative of the composer's mind and the society that it's created from. And I hope the stuff that I do does the same thing. I also think, I think musicians are an incredibly valuable part of society, or craftspeople. I think as highly trained, virtuosic craftspeople who have a real function in their world, and that doesn't just have to be educational. I think if you say, I'm a musician or I'm a composer and I want to be of use, people say, well, there is an educational purpose for that. And I think, well, actually, there is a sociological purpose for this as well.
Mm-hmm. I think that's so important. And it really chimes with me in terms of what I want the Ulster Orchestra to be doing. We often sort of tell ourselves stories of how important an orchestra or any kind of arts institution is to a city, to a place, that we help people tell their own stories and we help people find meaning. And sometimes it's not obvious, I think, how orchestras might be doing that through a sequence of Beethoven symphonies or the standard programme of an overture, a concerto, interval, and a symphony. It's so important for me, I think, that we keep finding ways to not to kind of reach out to people and democratise what we do, but actually to find the stories and find the narratives and give them space and give those artists the space and the resource to be able to play with some of those ideas.
And to relish in virtuosity. What is totally brilliant about orchestral music and opera and mass theatre practice is the virtuosity on display for audiences. I remember doing a thing years and years and years ago at a conference, and they said I got in trouble because I said I believed that excellence was the best calling card for the arts. And somebody started tweeting about how that was completely the wrong ethic
It's an interesting word.
in
It's
the
a
arts.
rich word.
And the next day, in a talk at the conference, it was like a Victoria Wood sketch. They put up on a huge projection a Syrian refugee called Omar. And somebody made a speech and said, "Do you think Omar worries about excellence? He just wants a ticket." I had to stop the whole thing, and I said, I think he does. I think by giving excellence to people, irrespective of background, or where they're from or how much they can afford, it's the excellence that matters, and connecting that excellence to the story around that person. And saying, we're making this from the society that you also come from. And we're doing it incredibly well. And we're doing it in a way that a busker on the street cannot do. It's a highly trained art form. It's a highly virtuosic art form. And it's an art form that has survived for a very, very long time. And it's continuing to grow. Music is this impossibly brilliant thing that just keeps rolling. And the one thing that I know is that there are two types of music, bad music and good music. And the good music always goes back to the excellence, and people wanting excellence, and people wanting to bear witness to it, be part of it, and to say that it's from the place that they live in.
Conor, it's been fantastic listening to you talk, and I really hope you all enjoy Conor's piece and this performance by the Belfast Ensemble and the Ulster Orchestra. It was a real pleasure putting it together. And Conor, we've got some other things in the works which we look forward to sharing with you over the coming season. But for now, thanks very much.
Thank you.